All right, good morning. So we're going to be starting with chapter 24, which is on the digestive system. Last week we finished a couple of two more systems. And today we're going to be finishing a couple more before we move on to our final lecture next week, where we will culminate the course. So when we look at the digestive system, again, what are in terms of the digestive system, again, the digestive system is responsible for the process of digestion, and we're going to be talking more about that. But pretty much, again, when the process of digestion, it involves both the physical as well as the chemical breakdown of foods, or what we call food, which are, again, elements that we put into our mouth that help provide us with energy, along with water, along with minerals and nutrients, to not only drive the energy requirements of the body, but also to provide the body with the key components that it needs for each and every cell to carry out processes. Now, once these, foods and are broken down both physically as well as chemically in our body, it then needs to be absorbed. And again, absorption, this is the next another responsibility for the digestive system. When you look at this term gastroenterology, again, gastro means stomach, enter means intestine. So this essentially is referring to the stomach and intestines, study of stomach and intestines. Now, proctology, now gastroenterology, GI, yes, while it does mean literally, it means stomach and intestines, it also includes all the other organs that play a role in digestion as well. Proctology, this specifically refers to the last part of the large intestine. Again, this large intestine, small intestines, primarily the key difference between small and large intestine is that small intestine is where absorption will be taking place, whereas in large intestine, this is the passage of waste products. Okay, so again, whatever is not used or is absorbed within the small intestines, it then moves into the largest intestines for the process of being removed from our body in the form of feces and defecation. Now, the other thing that happens in the large intestines, is not only just waste product, but also in the large intestine, there will be water that gets reabsorbed also. So this is very important. Water reabsorption takes place in the large intestine. So when you look over here, what we have is again, we're looking at the organs of digestion. So what's this? First of all, digestion starts off in our mouth. So again, through our again, when we ingest food or when we take food in, the food is, well, we have, for example, these our salivary glands. There's many pairs of glands actually. So not only are there the salivary glands or the sublingual. Sub means under. Lingual means ling means tongue. So the gland that are found under the tongue, they're secreting saliva. In addition to that, there's also high above the parotid glands, and all the way underneath our mandible, there's also the submandibular glands. So again, these the salivary glands, the sublingual, the parotid, and the sublingual, parotid, and the submandibular make up our salivary glands. These three glands. So we take food, okay, and food comes through, we put food through our mouth. Mouth is what makes up our oral cavity. And what we have over here within the oral cavity would be our teeth as well as our tongue. And again, teeth chops down the food, breaks down the food physically. Tongue helps push the food back into the throat. From that point on, food will then move down to the throat, which is the pharynx. And then from that point on, it will enter the tube that connects the throat to the stomach, and which is right over here. So that is the esophagus, which is the tube that connects it. After that, we have the liver over here. All right, liver is another. It's a very important organ. Liver has more than 500 functions. Amongst the functions is also it has a responsibility for processing, helping breaking down food. It helps, liver produces bile. Okay, bile ends up being stored in the gallbladder, which is also one of the components for the digestive system. Other thing that we have is pancreas. We discussed pancreas when we were going over the endocrine system, and you guys know that pancreas produces both insulin as well as glucagon. So liver, gallbladder, pancreas. Then we have the intestines. And the intestines, they get divided into small and large. So the small intestines, it gets subdivided into 3 parts. Now, for the small intestine, the 3 parts that it gets divided are as. We'll talk about the 3 parts as we move through the lecture. But for example, the second part is the jejunum. The last part is the ileum. Moving on to the jejunum. Okay, so that's all that's listed over here. Just a minute. We have the what else do we have? As far as the large intestine goes, again, we have this part that's going up. So this is the last part, the ileum of the small intestine. So this last part, where it ends, then of the small intestines ends, the large intestine starts. So over here we have all of this is large intestines. So this part that's going upwards, this is the ascending colon. Part that goes across is the transverse. Part that comes down, this is the descending colon. Okay, and this part is of the last part of the large intestines we call the rectum. Then there's the anal canal, and the opening is called anus. At the ascending colon, right, the inferiormost portion, we have a vestigial structure. Okay? This vestigial structure is referred to as the appendix. Right? Now, what does vestigial mean? Vestigial mean, again, at one point it was thought to be vestigial. I should rephrase that. They thought it was functionless. However, we now know that the appendix is not actually, it's not functionless. It actually has, it plays a role in, the process of for our immune system. Okay, it plays a role in that. So this is the purpose for appendix. It has an immune component to it. Let's move along. Okay, next slide we're looking at over here. Our fourth slide over here. We have the overview. All right, so again, overview, we kind of went over this already in the last picture, where we looked at and visited these components: mouth, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small intestines, large intestines. The next slide that we move on to is, let's see, all right, so again, we talk about the accessory digestive organs. So accessory digestive organs, so these are the main components of the digestive system. Now, another name for the digestive system or the gastrointestinal, so we have GI tract. In addition to that, it's also called the alimentary canal. Okay, so the gastrointestinal tract or the alimentary canal, again, it's going to be made up of these components. Now, as we move along, fifth slide, again, it talks about the accessory digestive organs. So they include these that are listed as follows. We have the teeth, the tongue, the salivary gland, the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. Again, we looked at the photographs in the previous slide. So again, I told you, and I also explained this to you as well, in terms of the functions of the digestive system. Whereas, again, we take food in through our mouth, or again, that is the process that occurs through the process of ingestion, taking food in. Now, as we ingest the food, our body starts secreting specifically the salivary glands. In the mouth, they start to secrete saliva. Again, other accessory structures, like again, pancreas is going to start secreting certain chemicals. Our stomach will start to secrete certain chemicals. Gallbladder will start to secrete its content, which is called bile. So secretion is also one of the functions of the digestive system. Now, once that content reaches the stomach, then there's mixing and propulsion that takes place. So digestion essentially is the breakdown of the chemical and physical breakdown of that food that we put into our mouth. Now, when we take food and we put it in our mouth, that's called a bolus. Bolus, okay, B-O-L-U-S. Now, when that bolus, it reaches the stomach and it mixes up with the chemicals, now it's no longer called a bolus, but it's no longer called food either. We call it chyme, C-H-Y-M-E, chyme, right? So that chyme then is ready to be absorbed in the small intestines, and whatever doesn't get absorbed into the small intestines then moves on to the large intestines, where again it gets removed through the process of defecation. So when we look at mechanical digestion, chemical digestion, absorption, defecation. Defecation again, so again, when you have waste, you have indigestible substances, even bacteria that live within large intestines, and resident bacteria, they also get shed from the lining of our GI tract from the large intestines. And other digestive materials that weren't absorbed, they end up leaving the body. Again, they exit the body through the anus. And this process is we refer to as defecation. Okay, and what is that material that leaves the body through the process of defecation? It's called feces. Okay, feces is the waste product. Okay. Now, looking at mucosa. So mucosa is referring, or another term for mucosa would be the inner lining of the GI tract. Now, this is a mucous membrane. Okay. It's made up of a layer of epithelium that's in direct contact with the contents of the GI tract. And the second part is made up of areolar connective tissue. There's a third part as well, which is a thin layer of smooth muscle, and that's called the muscularis mucosae. All right, so these are the three components for the mucosa. Now, the epithelium in the mouth, the pharynx, esophagus, and the anal canal, it's primarily made up of non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. right? And its job is to serve as a protective measure. Okay, so it has a protective function to it. There's also simple columnar epithelium that functions to secrete and absorb. And in addition to that, it also lines the stomach as well as the intestines. We find them in both places, in the intestines as well as stomach. These simple columnar cells, they're held in position via tight junctions. And again, tight junctions, it prevents leakage between the cells. Now, the rate of renewal of the GI tract epithelial cells is it occurs pretty quickly. It takes anywhere between 5 to 7 days, so about roughly a work week, or again, a full week. Again, eventually, after that time, they end up getting shed off, and then, it ends up being removed through the process of defecation from our body. Now, amongst these epithelial cells, there's also exocrine cells that are found, and these exocrine cells, they secrete mucus and other fluids into the opening of the tract, and that opening is referred to as the lumen, Lumen. Aside from that, there's also other types of endocrine cells that are found. So again, collectively, we call these the enteroendocrine cells. That's enteroendocrine, enteroendocrine cells. Okay, and again, these enteroendocrine cells, they secrete hormones. The lamina propria, it's primarily composed of areolar connective tissue. And again, it contains many layers of not only blood vessels, but yes, it contains many blood vessels as well as lymphatic vessels. Again, this is where the process of absorption essentially is taking place. Okay? So again, they carry the nutrients that are absorbed by the GI tract. It ends up returning back to the heart. So this layer, it supports the epithelium, and it also binds it to the layer underneath, which is the muscularis mucosa. Now the lamina propria, it also holds most of the cells of the mucosa associated lymphatic tissue, okay, which is also referred to as MALT, M-A-L-T, mucosa associated lymphatic tissue. Now, these very prominent lymphatic nodules, they contain immune system cells that protect against disease. So MALT is present along the GI tract. Now, they're concentrated especially within the tonsils, the small intestines, appendix, as well as the large intestines. And again, these areas, the components that I named, they contain nearly as many immune cells that are present in the rest of our body. Okay, so they're highly concentrated over here. So the lymphocytes and the macrophages in the mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, they end up mounting immune responses against, again, any pathogen or a microbe for that matter that may be able to penetrate the epithelium. So the last part, again, this is a thin layer of smooth muscle fibers, and we refer to this as the muscularis mucosa. And it causes the mucous membrane of the stomach, small intestines to form a lot of small folds, and this ends up increasing the surface area for digestion as well as for absorption. Now, movements of the muscularis mucosa, it makes sure that all the absorptive cells, they end up being totally exposed to the contents of the GI tract. Now, the muscular mucosa of the small intestines, they surround the lacteal lymphatic vessels as well. So contraction of these smooth muscle cells, it helps move the lymph along the vessels. All right. Now, the next slide, we talk about the submucosa. And the submucosa is a thin meshwork of collagenous fibers. There's nerves present as well as blood vessels. The submucosa, it consists of areolar connective tissue, which binds the mucosa to the middle layer. Okay, and the middle layer is the muscularis. Submucosa is highly vascular, and it also contains the submucosal plexus. Another term for that is the plexus of Meissner. Okay, and it is a part of the autonomic nervous system, which again we refer to specifically as the ENS, or the enteric nervous system. So remember, the enteric nervous system, this, as I told you before, the ENS, the enteric nervous system, this is the brain of our gut. Again, it doesn't use our brain. Now, it may be influenced, the digestive system may be influenced by the brain, but again, ENS is what's responsible for its needs. It measures, it controls and measures. ENS is made up of about 100 million neurons. Okay, 100 million neurons. All right. When we talk about the muscularis, again, muscularis, we have it within the mouth, the pharynx, in addition to the superior as well as the middle parts of the esophagus, and it's containing skeletal muscles. Okay, and these skeletal muscles produce voluntary swallowing. Skeletal muscles, they also form the external anal sphincter, and again, the external anal sphincter, it permits the voluntary control of defecation. So the remainder of the tract, the muscularis, is made up of smooth muscle, right? And we find it generally in two sheets. There's an inner sheet, which consists of circular fibers, and there's an outer sheet, which are made up of longitudinal fibers. So again, these involuntary contractions of these two layers is what assists in both the physical breakdown as well as the mixing of food in the along with the digestive secretions within the GI, the alimentary canal, I should say. Now the muscularis, let's see. So okay, that's good. Next part is going to be the serosa. So the portions of the GI tract that we find suspended in the abdominal cavity, they have a superficial layer which is called the serosa. Now, serosa is a serous membrane. It's made up of areolar connective tissue as well as simple squamous epithelium. Simple squamous epithelium, and this is also referred to as the mesothelium. The epithelial part of the serosa is also referred to as the visceral peritoneum, because it ends up forming the portion of the peritoneum that surrounds the organs that are suspended in the peritoneal cavity. So this term serosa, it comes from it comes from the fact that the epithelium has a lubricating coat of serous fluid. Serous fluid is just a watery solution that consists of electrolytes and other solutes that come from interstitial fluid of the adjacent tissue that we find along with blood plasma from the local capillaries. Now, serous fluid, in addition to that, it also holds a lot of different types of white blood cells as well. So when you look over here in this slide, what we see, again, we have over here we see the, so here's this is all epithelium over here, okay, it's the epithelium. And this part would be the areolar connective tissue, okay, so the epithelium and the areolar connective tissue is what makes the serosa. So that's the serosa over here. You can see the mesenteric plexus over here. Again, this is part of what? The enteric nervous system, okay? So that's the serosa. All right, after the serosa, what do we have? What do we look at? Then we look at thick layer of muscle. So obviously this is the muscularis. Now when you look at the muscularis, we see a couple things happening. So over here, when you look at it, this layer, this layer of smooth muscle is arranged in these longitudinal sheets. So therefore, this is the longitudinal muscle that we have over here. Now this part over here, it's the fibers are arranged in circular sheets. So this is a circular muscle. So again, what we end up having is circular and longitudinal. So, they end up squeezing and contracting and mixing, and everything that takes place within the digestive system. Propulsion is responsible for these alternating layers of muscles that are found in, again, different directions. One is circular, the other is up and down longitudinal. All right, so we looked at the serosa, we looked at the muscularis. Now let's look at this part over here. This is the submucosa. So again, in submucosa, what do we see? We see a lot of glands that you can find. Also, we see, so this is a gland that are part of the submucosa over here. There's also some blood vessels that you have over here. Then we have the mucosa over here, all right? Now, mucosa is made up of the epithelial and epithelium. Then there's the lamina propria, and then the outermost part is the muscularis mucosae. Okay, so these three parts, they form the mucosa. Okay, and then also again, you can see we have glands within the submucosa that are also found over there, and also over here within the mucosa, we also have other glands that are over here, in addition to lymphatic vessels. So these lymphatic vessels, these are the mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, or the MALT. These green structures that are seen over here throughout. So again, these are the glands that we find within the mucosa, and then these that extend outwards, these are those of the submucosa. All right. When we look over here, the peritoneum. So the peritoneum is the second largest serous membrane of the body. It's made up of a layer of simple squamous epithelium with an underlying supporting layer of connective tissue. Peritoneum ends up being divided into a parietal peritoneum, which lines the walls of the abdominal cavity, as well as the visceral peritoneum. Okay, so peritoneum is also referred to as the serosa that we just learned in the previous slides. And again, the serosa, it covers some of the organs within the abdominal cavity. The greater omentum, all right, the greater omentum is a large peritoneal fold that drapes over the transverse colon, and it drapes over the transverse colon. So again, it's kind of gets referred to as a fatty apron. That's what the greater omentum, is also referred to as a fatty, or it would be described as a fatty apron. So again, it's a double shield. It's a double sheet that folds back upon itself, and again, it ends up, because it kind of folds back up upon itself, it ends up creating about a 4-sheet thickness. If you were to look at it, it ends up being total 4 layers just because it kind of folds upon itself. So the greater omentum, it extends. It starts at the curvature of our stomach, okay, and the very first part of our small intestines, which is called the duodenum. Duodenum, that's the first part of the small intestines. So it goes from the curvature of the stomach down to the duodenum, and then it continues to extend downward, anterior to the small intestines, and then it turns and it extends upwards and attaches to the transverse colon. So the greater omentum, it normally contains a good amount of fat tissue as well, adipocytes, adipose cells. So it's adipose tissue. It could get pretty big. It can expand rather well. And again, so when you gain weight, this is one of the key areas where that fat tissue ends up being deposited. So again, this is what people, when people say, when you say that somebody has a bear belly or a ekmek gobek, for example, or a pilav gobek, that's where that fat is actually being stored within this bear belly, within this the greater omentum. It holds a lot of fat over there. Now, the primary or the main lymph nodes of the greater omentum is what contributes to macrophage and antibody producing plasma cells that help fight and contain infections of the GI system, of our GI tract. All right. The falciform ligament. The falciform ligament attaches the liver to the anterior abdominal wall and the diaphragm. Now, the liver is the only digestive organ that's attached to the anterior abdominal wall. The lesser omentum, it arises as an anterior fold of the serosa of the stomach and duodenum. Okay, so the lesser omentum, again, it arises as an anterior fold of the serosa of the stomach as well as the duodenum. The lesser omentum is going to connect the stomach and the duodenum to the liver, and it's a pathway of blood vessels entering the liver, and it also contains the hepatic portal veins, the common hepatic artery, as well as the common bile duct. In addition to that, there's also some lymph vessels. So that's lesser omentum. All right. So another fold of the peritoneum is called the mesentery. Okay. The mesentery is also it's another fold of the peritoneum. It's fan-shaped and it binds the jejunum and ileum of the small intestines to the posterior wall of the posterior abdominal wall. Okay. So the mesentery, it binds the jejunum as well as the ileum to the posterior abdominal wall. It's the largest peritoneal fold, and it's also consists of a lot of fat, and also it contributes to an enlarged abdomen in obese individuals. So again, it extends from the posterior abdominal wall, essentially to wrap around almost the entire length of the small intestines, and then it returns back to where it started. So again, it forms by doing that, it ends up forming a double layer structure. All right, mesocolon. Mesocolon, again, this is two separate folds of the peritoneum, all right, that make up the mesocolon. So the mesocolon is going to be, so here, let me rephrase that. Yeah, so two separate folds of the peritoneum, all right? Two separate folds of the peritoneum that are called the mesocolon bind the transverse colon and the sigmoid colon, okay? So the transverse colon sometimes is also called the transverse mesocolon, and the sigmoid colon is also sometimes called the sigmoid mesocolon. And again, these are both part of the large intestines. And we find this posterior to the abdominal wall. Both the transverse and the sigmoid mesocolons, they carry blood vessels, lymphatic vessels of the to the intestines. The mesentery and the mesocolon, they both hold the intestines loosely in place, and again, it allows for a much greater amount of movement take place, as the muscular contractions, they end up mixing and moving the contents along the GI tract. All right, so over here again, you can see here's the greater omentums over here. You can see the liver over here. This is the left lobe and the right lobe of the liver that can be seen here. And now if you take this omentum and you kind of flip it up, you can see why it's called an apron, right? A fatty apron, because look, it just drapes essentially the anterior abdominal wall. So over here again, you can see the small intestine, part of the small intestines, and also you can see the large intestines over there. This part over here is the ascending colon. This part over here is the transverse colon, and then this part over here, that's all descending colon. And then over here, this is the sigmoid colon, this S-shaped. And all right, what's next? Next we have mouth. All right, as for the mouth is also called the buccal cavity, or sometimes it could also be referred to as the oral cavity. And mouth is formed by our cheeks. And there's a hard palate, soft palate, and tongue, which are all components of it. Cheeks, our cheeks are covered externally by skin, and internally it's covered by a mucous membrane. Again, very high turnover of cells, so repair takes place almost immediately. If you, excuse me, if you've ever eaten something very hot and you kind of burned the inside of your mouth, your cheek, yeah, it bothers you for maybe a day or so, or 2 days, and then after that, it ends up being repaired. And again, the reason for that is because of, again, the very high turnover of cells that takes place because it's made up of mucous membrane. The buccinator or buccinator muscles, you want to call it buccinator, that's fine also. So both this buccinator or buccinator muscle as well as connective tissue, we end up finding between the skin and the mucous membranes of the cheek. Okay, so again, amongst the different type of connective tissue is fat as well. So you know, if some of these girls end up getting this procedure, they end up having what's called a bichectomy. And bichectomy essentially are the fat pads that are found within the cheek. So when a surgeon removes that fat pad, that's called a bichectomy. And again, why do they do? Well, they want to have their cheekbones appear more prominent and chiseled out. That's the function for that. So, all right, let's move on to mouth. So the oral vestibules, all right, of the oral cavity is the space between the space is bounded externally by the cheeks and the lips, and internally is bounded by the gums and teeth. So the oral cavity proper is the space that goes from the gums and teeth to the fauces, right? And the fauces, F-A-U-C-E-S, and literally translates into passages. Fauces translates into passages. So yeah, the palate, on the other hand, the palate is a wall or a septum. Okay, septum essentially means wall that separates the oral cavity from the nasal cavity. It also forms the roof of the mouth. So again, this is a rather important structure that makes it possible for us to chew and breathe at the same time. The hard palate, so again, this palate, it ends up being divided into hard and soft. So the hard palate, this is the anterior 2/3 of the palate, and it's formed by the maxilla and the palatine bones. It ends up being covered by a mucous membrane. Now the soft palate forms the posterior portion of the roof of the mouth. It's arch-shaped muscular portion between the oropharynx as well as the nasopharynx. So you find it between the oropharynx and the nasopharynx, and it's lined with the mucous membrane. Now, hanging from the free border of the soft palate, we end up having a finger-like muscular structure that's called the uvula. Okay, U-V-U-L-A, the uvula. So during swallowing, the soft palate and the uvula end up being pulled superiorly, closing off the nasopharynx. And this is what prevents the foods that we swallowed to enter the nasal cavity. And, for that matter, even substance that we may have drunk prevents them from going up into the nose. Okay, so what prevents that? Uvula and soft palate, because they get pushed upwards during swallowing. Now, lateral to the base of the uvula, we have two muscular folds that run down the lateral sides of the soft palate. So, anteriorly, there is the palatoglossal arc, and it extends to the side of the base of the tongue. And posteriorly, we have the palatopharyngeal arc, and it extends to the side of the pharynx. So the palatine tonsils, they're found between the arches. The lingual tonsils, we find them at the base of the tongue. And at the posterior border of the soft palate, the mouth opens into the oropharynx through structures that are referred to as the fauces. Okay, fauces, F-A-U-C-E-S. All right, let's see. So over here, in this picture, we can kind of see all these things that we talked about. So what do we have over here? This is the front part, the front 2/3, and this is all hard palate. Now, when you move back over here, this is the muscular tissue over here, and this is what? Soft palate. So again, these two parts, they end up forming the roof of our mouth, hard palate and soft palate. So when we swallow, this moves upwards as well as this. And this is the uvula. So this prevents food from going up into the nasal cavity. And this part over here, these arches, these are called the fauces. You have fauces here. Here's your tongue, okay? This is your tongue, and what kind of holds your tongue in place and prevents it from being, for you to swallow it, your tongue, is this little structure here underneath the tongue, which is called the lingual frenulum, okay? Or very simply, frenulum, lingual frenulum. Here's that oral vestibule. Again, this is that space between your gums and your lips, as well as the cheeks. Okay, oral vestibule. That's this part over here, this area. That you can see your teeth. And again, if you notice here, different type of shapes for the teeth at different positions. Over here we have our molar teeth. Okay. Over here we have our premolars. Pre means before the molars. You have premolars, and then we have canines, a pair of canines, and then there's also these front teeth, which are called incisors, and they kind of act as scissors. They finally cut food. These incisors. What else? I think that's enough information from this slide. So you can see the gum. Earlier on, we looked at I showed you the salivary glands. Again, we have 3 pairs of them. So again, the salivary gland, again, this is a gland that releases secretions, and the secretions are called saliva. And where they get released into, these secretions end up being secreted into the oral cavity. Okay. So when food enters the mouth, secretions of saliva will increase. Okay, and again, you end up increasing these salivary, or again, these oral secretions, because saliva acts not only to lubricate, but also chemically dissolve and break down the food. That is of the role of saliva. So again, the chemical breakdown of food initially starts in our mouth, okay, through saliva. So yeah, the parotid, the submandibular, and sublingual glands. These are 3 major salivary glands. Okay, these are major salivary glands. Again, so there are secretions that they produce. They end up being emptied into the ducts that connect that connect to the oral cavity. So we already looked at the photos and looked at the parotid gland, submandibular gland, and the sublingual gland. Again, there's ducts that drain each one of these as well. So the parotid gland ends up being drained by the parotid duct. The submandibular gland ends up being drained by the submandibular duct, and the sublingual gland ends up being drained by the sublingual duct. Now, the salivary glands, they end up getting both sympathetic as well as parasympathetic innervation. Amongst the chemicals that we have, one of them is called amylase. Okay, amylase. So amylase is a salivary enzyme that has a role in carbohydrate or starch breakdown in the mouth. Okay, that's salivary amylase. The other one is lingual lipase. And lipase, it starts to break down fat. Okay, and it ends up being secreted by the lingual glands. So over here you can see submandibular. You see the parotid, and well, unfortunately you cannot see the sublingual very well, but you do see the submandibular, the parotid, as well as, well, you can see this muscle over here, for example. It's one of the main chewing muscle, the masseter that's here. Parotid gland, masseter. Okay, very well. All right. The tongue is an accessory digestive organ that's made up of skeletal muscle, and it's also covered with mucous membrane. So along with its, with its muscles, tongue forms the floor of the oral cavity, and the tongue gets divided into symmetrical lateral halves by a median septum that goes from, again, that it extends the entire length. And ends up being attached, tongue ends up being attached to the hyoid bone, Hyoid. Hyoid bone attaches and anchors the tongue in place. Aside from the hyoid bone, it's also attached to the styloid process of the temporal bone, as well as our mandible. Now, each half of the tongue is made up of an identical mix of both extrinsic as well as intrinsic muscles. The extrinsic muscles of the tongue, they originate outside the tongue, and it attaches to bones in the area. And again, they end up being inserted into connective tissue in the tongue, and it includes the hypoglossus, the genoglossus, as well as the styloglossus muscles. The extrinsic muscles, they move the tongue from side to side, and in addition to being able to move it in and out. Okay. All right. The intrinsic muscles of the tongue, they originate and insert into the connective tissue within the tongue and alter shape as well as the size of the tongue for speech and swallow to occur. Now, the intrinsic muscles, they include the longitudinalis superior and the longitudinalis inferior and the transverse linguae and the verticalis linguae muscles. Okay. And I told you what the frenulum was. So the lingual frenulum is just a fold of mucous membrane that we have in the middle of the inferiormost part of the tongue. So again, it's attached to the floor of the mouth, and it limits the movement of the tongue backwards. So again, it's the thing that prevents you from swallowing your tongue. Now, if a lingual frenulum is, again, abnormally short, we call that ankyloglossia. Okay, ankyloglossia. That's just an abnormally short or stiff frenulum, lingual frenulum. All right, so let's take a break now. We'll continue a little bit. All right. So let's begin. Let's go over. Um, all right. So we went over this. All right. So teeth. So the teeth, they're also called the dentes. Okay, dentes, or the dentes. And a typical tooth is made up of three principal parts, three main parts, and they are the crown. You have the neck, the dentin, the enamel, and the pulp cavity. So in the neck, the crown, that's the part that it's a visible part that's above the level of the gums. Uh, now, 1 to 3 roots are embedded in each socket. The neck is made up of it's a constricted junction of the crown and root near the gum line. Now, internally, dentin forms the majority of the tooth. Dentin is made up of a calcified connective tissue that gives the tooth its shape and as well its rigidity. Dentin is harder than bone because of the higher content of hydroxyapatite. It's also different from bone in that it doesn't have blood vessels, and dentin does not remodel as bone does. What else? Dentin, it has what's called the dentinal, dentinal, dentinal tubules, and it has parallel microscopic tubules that radiate throughout the pulp cavity. The cells that produce dentin are called odontoblasts. O-D-O N-T-O-B-L-A-S-T-S. Okay, odontoblasts. O-D-O-N-T-O-B-L-A-S-T-S. Odontoblasts. Again, odontoblasts, they line the pulp cavity and they send their cytoplasmic processes into the dentinal tubules. Now, the dentin of the crown ends up being covered by enamel. Okay, and enamel is primarily calcium phosphate and calcium carbonate. Enamel is also harder than bone because it has an even higher content of hydroxyapatite. So dentin is about 70%. Enamel is about 95%. Okay, of its dry weight. Enamel is actually the hardest substance we have in our body. And again, it's thickest over the cusps and it tapers to a thin edge at the neck, the neck of the root of the tooth, at the neck of the tooth. Now, the dentin of the root ends up being covered by cementum. And cementum is another bone-like substance which ends up cementum attaches the root to the periodontal ligaments. Now, within the dentin of a tooth, we find an enclosed space. Now, the enlarged part of the space is called the pulp cavity, and it lies within the crown and it ends up being filled with a pulp. Okay, you can have a cavity for the pulp, and therefore you can have a pulp as well. And pulp is a connective tissue that has blood vessels, nerves, and lymphatic vessels. Now, extensions of the pulp cavity are called root canals, and they run through the root of a tooth. Each root canal has an opening at the base. That's called the apical through the apical foramen. And again, the blood vessels and lymphatic vessels and nerves, they enter a tooth through this apical foramen, A-P-I-C-A-L, apical. If you guys remember apical from other organs that we looked at also. such as the apex of the heart. Okay, and then we talked about epithelial tissue, talking about the apical surface of those cells. Okay, next, let's see, what's next? Next we have, okay, so over here in this picture, you can see, what do we see here? We have enamel over here. And then there's dentin. There's the dentin. So again, you can see the enamel plus the dentin. It makes up the crown of the tooth. Then you have the neck. The neck, again, think it this way. The neck is the part that extends a little bit above where the bone starts and where you are able to see the gum, okay? So the part where you can see the gum, your gum, or gingiva, okay? Gingiva means gum. And going all the way deep to the bone is the region of the neck. Now, where the bone starts and it goes all the way downwards, okay, to the deepest blood vessel, that's all. The rest of it is root. Okay, so these are the three principal areas: crown, neck, and root. So what do we say here? This is enamel, okay, up to 95% hydroxyapatite. This is about 75% hydroxyapatite. Below that, we have what? The pulp cavity. Now, all the contents within this pulp cavity, we call it the pulp over here. And this part here, this is that root canal. So this is the root of the tooth. And where these blood vessels and nerves pass through are the canal, the root canal, all right? Here you can see the periodontal ligaments that help anchor the tooth in place. Now, at the base, you have this opening, which you call the apical foramen, okay? This is where blood vessels and nerves, they enter this cavity, pulp cavity. And here's that underlying blood supply that's there, blood and nerve supply. All right. Next, we have deciduous teeth. Deciduous teeth is also what we call baby teeth. Okay, so humans, we have two sets of dentition. Okay, so another term for teeth is dentition. Okay, two sets of dentition, D-E-N-T-I-T-I-O-N-S. We have deciduous and permanent teeth. Okay, permanent teeth, okay, and deciduous. So the first set of teeth that we have is this deciduous teeth. Your permanent teeth, they end up being the second set that you end up getting afterwards. So this deciduous teeth, the first set, you also some people call it the primary teeth, some people call it the milk teeth or your baby teeth. And they start to come out at about 6 months of age. You end up getting a pair at like nearly every month after 6 months. And then you end up getting 20 of these, these baby teeth, or again, 20 of these deciduous teeth, or 20 of these milk teeth. All right. The deciduous molars end up being replaced by the first and second premolars. We also call these the bicuspids. Okay. So this first and second premolars, they end up replacing the deciduous molars. Okay. They replace the deciduous molars. All right, here we go. Now you can see it. So these are your deciduous teeth, and if you count them up, you got 10 here and 10 there. Okay. In adults, you have what? 16 and 16. All right, up to 16 and 16, I should say. So let's just look at adult teeth. The other thing is when you look at these, your baby teeth, your deciduous teeth, they're more rounded shape. They're more like cartoon shape in structure. All right. Now these over here, we'll look at the adult teeth, lower and upper. Essentially, the ones in the front, these are our incisors. The ones that are at the very front are the central incisors. Lateral to them, you have the lateral incisors. And then lateral to those, you have the canines. Canines used to tear through foods, whereas incisors are used in shredding food. And then afterwards, you have the premolars and the molars that are there, the first, second, and third molars, right? And these that you see, essentially they're used for grinding food, okay? Especially this one over here. So again, if you think about it, as we take food in, we start tearing and ripping from the front. Then we move the food to the side where we start to shred it up. And then from that point on, then we start to chew it towards the back of to the side of our mouth, okay? This is the process. Here we go. And you can see over here, this is the skull of a child that, again, there are teeth up over here. You can see some of the roots, and then you can see some teeth that have not erupted as well. So again, over here, you can see that these will come out, they're at a specific age, they'll end up coming out, they will emerge. You can see over here, they have emerged at this point, but at this point, they're still up above. Same thing over here. There's still tooth up there that's that's going to push this one out, and then it will grow in. Okay, so two sets of teeth that we end up having. All right. Now, as for the pharynx, all right, pharynx. So chewing is also called mastication. M-A-S-T-I-C-A-T-I-O-N, mastication. Okay. Chewing, okay, it's also mastication. So as you chew food, okay, as your teeth are grinding it, your tongue starts taking that and pushing it towards the back of your mouth, okay, into your pharynx. So food, once it gets grinded and comes into contact and mixes with saliva, it's not called food anymore. As I said earlier, it's called a bolus, B-O-L-U-S. Okay, and again, it's moist, it's slippery, and it allows it to be swallowed relatively easy. Let's see. Yeah, so when you take that food into your throat, it allows you to swallow it. And the term for swallowing is actually is referred to as deglution. Deglution. D-E-G-L-U-T-I-T-I-O-N. Okay, D-E-G-L-U-T-I-T-I-O-N. And again, swallowing is a mechanism that moves food from the mouth to the stomach. And again, saliva and mucus, it helps that bolus slide down through the esophagus, okay, through your food tube, the esophagus. So again, remember, you have the nasopharynx, it's the superiormost part, oropharynx behind the mouth, laryngopharynx, that's at the border between the larynx and again the what's eventually will be your esophagus, because again, food ends up being carried into the esophagus, not into the larynx. If the food would move into the larynx, then you would be choking and you would die after that point. Something ends up being lodged there and cause an obstruction for air, for the gases to move. Again, you can see over here the different layers. This is just the histology of the esophagus. So you have the mucosa, submucosa over here, the muscularis. Again, this is the circulum muscularis. Okay, and then here's the longitudinal layer of the muscularis. And also you can see it's this part of the esophagus is innervated by the cranial nerve 10, your vagus nerve. Excuse me. Now, let's look over here. They talk about the upper esophageal sphincter. So yeah, elevation of the larynx, it causes that sphincter to relax. And when it relaxes, it lets the bolus enter that the esophagus. Now, the contents of the esophagus, in other words, the bolus, when it's inside the esophagus, it ends up moving downwards. Yes, partly it's through gravity, but it's also through peristalsis, okay, through the alternating contraction and relaxation of both the circular and the longitudinal muscles of the esophagus allows for the movement of the content of the esophagus to be able to enter it into the stomach. So again, you have an upper sphincter, and then there's also a lower sphincter. Okay, that lower esophageal sphincter is also called the gastroesophageal, or sometimes it's called the cardiac sphincter. So if you look over here, here's this cardiac sphincter over here. Up above it, you would have the upper esophageal sphincter. So lower esophageal, upper esophageal sphincter. Here's that bolus right over here. Okay, it's just food and saliva and maybe some other chemicals that are mixed with. When it enters, okay, when it enters the esophagus, you can see this part is contracting and this part's relaxed. Once this bolus, after this contracts, it moves forward, then the part behind it will contract. So it's just contraction and relaxation that ends up pushing the contents all the way into the stomach. Okay, so that's that. What else is there? All right, gastroesophageal reflux. So what ends up happening, GERD. Now, if you look over here, notice that the stomach is almost like a J shape in nature. Okay, it's almost J-shaped. Now, when it's in this natural shape, the valves of these the sphincters, in other words, these two parts, they match up. All right, they're even up. So when they do that, they're able to squeeze nicely and form a good tight seal. Now, sometimes what ends up happening is that this valve, this sphincter, it's not able to close properly. Okay, if it's not able to close properly, one of the things that could happen is that the contents of this food, which is the contents of the stomach, which is extremely acidic, end up coming up over here, okay, into the esophagus. This is what you call heartburn, okay? And when it happens chronically, it's called gastroesophageal reflux disease. Okay, gastroesophageal reflux disease. Again, this is chronic. It happens over over a long period of time, every day. So, GERD. Another cause of it is sometimes your stomach is just producing too much acid. But again, the doctors, they give you some medications to decrease the amount of acid that's produced, and it's how it's not a cure, but it's just a way to deal with gastroesophageal reflux disease. In many people, it could be addressed relatively easily. You diet, you lose weight. When you lose weight, now your stomach, all that fat that's there, is not pulling the stomach down, which allows this the sphincters to realign nicely. When they realign, then they close up. Okay, but people want an easy solution. They just want to pop a pill and not exercise. It doesn't work that way. So, okay, I told you about this. Stomach is a J-shaped structure. I told you about that. We talked about this. Yeah, so again, the size and position of the stomach, again, depending on if your stomach is full or it's empty, it's gonna be different size. Okay, its position is also gonna vary. Start digestion, it continues within the stomach. Proteins and triglyceride digestion, it begins over here. At this point, that bolus, when it enters the stomach, it further gets chemically broken down. So not only chemical digestion, not only does it continue, but it expands within the stomach. And it also, the physical breakdown also expands within the stomach. Think of your stomach as like a blender and a mixer, all right? So now it's not called, that bolus ends up turning into a different substance. And at this point, it is called chyme, C-H-Y-M-E, chyme, C-H-Y-M-E, all right? When the bolus enters the stomach, we call it chyme. What's next? All right, the four main parts of the stomach. You have the cardia, fundus, body, and the pyloric part. The pyloric part, there's a few different subdivisions of it. You have the antrum, and it connects to the body of the stomach. The pyloric canal leads to the pylorus, and then you have the pylorus, which connects to the duodenum. Internally, you have these folds, right, that are called the rugae of the stomach. There's also, again, if there is a cardiac sphincter, on the other end, there's going to be a pyloric sphincter. So between the esophagus and the stomach, you have the cardiac sphincter, and between the stomach and the duodenum, the first part of the small intestine, you have the pyloric sphincter. When you look at the stomach, there's two curves that are present. One's referred to as a lesser curve, the other is called a greater curve. So again, it depends on which part you're looking at. So let's see if you can take a picture, look at a photograph of that. There's not a picture. I'm not sure why, but hopefully you guys, oh, here, perfect. So over here, you can see this is the lesser curvature, and here's the greater curvature over here. So if this is the cardiac sphincter up over here, then this is going to be the pyloric sphincter over here. This main part is the body of the stomach. The upper portion is called the cardia of the stomach, and the last part is called the pylorus of the stomach. Okay, this region is the pylorus. So this part is referred to as the pyloric canal. Okay. What else? Okay. All right, let's look at histology. The mucus that ends up being produced in the stomach is extremely important. That's what prevents the stomach from being digested by itself. Chief cells that are found in the stomach, they produce pepsinogen. Okay. Pepsinogen gets activated by the acid that's produced in the stomach, okay, into its active form called pepsin. Okay. So again, pepsinogen gets activated by the acid, and activated pepsinogen is referred to as pepsin. Parietal cells of the stomach produced this hydrochloric acid. Okay. Now, chief cells, which are also called the peptic cells, or sometimes they're called sometimes they're called gastric zymogenic cells. This is a type of cell that we find in the stomach that releases gastric lipase as well as pepsinogen. Okay, gastric lipase as well as pepsinogen ends up being released by them. Additionally, it produces something called chymosin. Okay, chymosin. There's also G cells, okay? G cells, or sometimes they're also referred to as lambda cells. This is a type of cell in the stomach as well as the duodenum that secretes gastrin, okay? G cells secrete gastrin. So it works with the gastric chief cells and the parietal cells. G cells, we find them deep within the pyloric glands of both of the antrum of the stomach. Gastrin is it's a peptide hormone, and gastrin stimulates the secretion of gastric acid by the parietal cells of the stomach. It also aids in motility, gastric motility. It ends up being released by G cells in the pyloric antrum of both the stomach, the duodenum, as well as the pancreas. So again, if you look at the histology, here's your mucosa, you have your submucosa, muscularis, and then there's a serosa underneath. So see, the highly epithelial, right? And you end up having these areas which are called the pits, okay, the gastric pits of the stomach. So why? Because it's, again, this is the apical surface up over here, and it leads into these pits. So they're called gastric pits, essentially. And again, you'll notice that these pits are also lined not only with blood vessels, but also with these lymphatic vessels. Aside from that, you have these lymphatic nodules as well. Protective measure as well is to absorb large fat and other large substances from the digestive system into circulation. It allows it to enter systemic circulation. What else? What do we need to see? Oh yeah, here. This is something good to look at. I would study this very well. And if you look at the gastric pits, you have surface mucus cells. What do? They secrete mucus. Then there's these neck cells that also secrete mucus. When you look at the parietal cells that you find deeper within the pits, they secrete hydrochloric acid as well as intrinsic factor. Moving along, you have chief cells that you can see as well. Chief cells, they end up producing gastric lipase as well as pepsinogen. And then deep to that, you'll have these G cells, okay, and they secrete the hormone gastrin. Okay, these are the G cells that you see over here. All right, so many minutes after food enters the stomach, you end up having this peristalsis that passes over the stomach about 15 to 25 seconds. These peristaltic waves, we find it in the fundus, and fundus primarily stores that bolus. The movement of the content of the GI tract forward, so the movement of the content forward is what's called propulsion, okay, or again, through these peristaltic waves. I told you chyme, what that is. Again, it's bolus combined with the digestive bolus. When it enters the stomach, we call it chyme. Now, when this term retropropulsion, if the contents of the duodenum, if the are too large, what ends up happening is they end up getting sent back into the stomach, from the duodenum back into the stomach to the pyloric canal, to the pylorus of the stomach. When that happens, that's called retropulsion. Okay, retro means backwards. So again, when chyme from the small intestines moves back into the stomach, we call that retropulsion. Again, when the food particles in chyme are small enough and they enter the duodenum of the small intestines and they stay there, when they enter the small intestine, that's called gastric emptying. Protein digestion, okay, is carried out by an enzyme called pepsin. Okay, pepsin is responsible for digesting proteins. Again, they're secreted by chief cells. Okay, and again, remember they're in an inactive form called pepsinogen. Okay, and pepsinogen, again, when it gets activated, it's called pepsin. And pepsin, essentially, what it does is it breaks down the peptide bonds that we find between the amino acids, right? So yes, another enzyme in the stomach is gastric lipase. Okay, and it helps break up triglycerides. Okay, it helps split up triglycerides. Yeah, that's gastric lipase. You know, in our mouth, we also have lingual lipase that gets secreted by the lingual glands. There's also our pancreas. It produces lipase as well. It's called pancreatic lipase. So again, what do we learned? Not only does the stomach produce gastric lipase, the pancreas also produces pancreatic lipase. But in addition to that, even our salivary glands, it produces lingual lipase. The stomach usually ends up being emptied anywhere between 2 to 4 hours after we eat. Okay, 2 to 4 hours after we eat. Now, what about the pancreas? When you look at the pancreas is made up of a head. There's a body. There's a tail. There's a pancreatic duct, hepatopancreatic ampulla, major duodenal papilla. Let's look at we'll look at pictures of this. So the pancreas, again, it's a retroperitoneal gland. In terms of its size, it's about maybe between 12 to 15 centimeters long, and it's about maybe about 2.5 centimeters thick. Yeah, between 2.5, 2 to 3 centimeters thick, about an inch or so, okay, in thickness. We find it lining posterior to the great curvature of the stomach. Let's see. Yeah, the pancreatic secretions, they pass from secreting cells into small ducts. And these small ducts, they end up coming together to form 2 larger ducts. So the larger the 2 ducts, it's called the duct of Wirsung. Okay, duct of Wirsung, W-I-R-S-U-N-G. Right. Another term for this duct of Wirsung, it's also called the pancreatic duct. So, you know, in most people, the pancreatic duct, it joins the common bile duct from the liver and gallbladder, and it enters the duodenum as a dilated common duct that's called the hepatopancreatic ampulla. Hepatopancreatic ampulla, or the ampulla of Vater. It's another term for it. The ampulla, it opens into, or not into, it opens up upon an elevation of the duodenal mucosa, which is called the major duodenal papilla. And it lies about 4 inches inferior to the pyloric sphincter of the stomach. Now, the small of the 2 ducts is called this is the small of the 2 ducts. It's called the duct of Santorini, or again, another term for that is the accessory duct. And it leads from the pancreas and empties into the duodenum, superior to the hepatopancreatic ampulla. So over here, you can see the pancreas. Okay, this is the tail, here's the body, and this would be the ampulla of Vater, okay, over here, right there. Here's these this unicate processes that you see throughout. Here's the duct of Santorini up over here. And again, this is this would be the part that connects to the stomach. So again, this is the very first starting of small intestines. We call that the duodenum. So remember the three parts of the small intestines: duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. Starting part is the duodenum, middle part of the small intestines is the jejunum. The last part of the small intestines is the ileum. All right, so the right and left hepatic duct, they end up connecting to the common hepatic duct from the liver, which ends up connecting to the common bile duct, and the common bile duct ends up converging with this pancreatic duct from the pancreas, and it ends up releasing its content into the duodenum. The cystic duct from the gallbladder, it connects to the common bile duct as well. It's sending its contents here. Pancreatic duct is sending its content there. Everything's going into the duodenum. Okay. So you have to understand that if you go back to the slide, as the contents of, as the chyme is starting to enter over here, different signals, alarms go off. Let's put it that way. Okay, to help better describe. As chyme enters, alarms start to go off. As alarms start to go off, if there's a lot of fat, for example, the cystic duct starts to squeeze and contract, and therefore you end up getting fat breakdown that starts to occur. Same thing with the pancreas. As a lot of fat comes over here, it will start producing chemicals that break down fats as well. Okay, so again, as different foods, they set off triggers to cause these to start secreting more of a specific enzyme for this matter. What's next? So I told you already about this. Pancreatic amylase is going to help break down some of the carbs that are found within the duodenum. Now, what about other enzymes that break proteins down? There's trypsin, chymotrypsin, carboxypeptidase, elastase. All these help in protein digestion. Pancreatic lipase, this is the main triglyceride breaking enzyme. That's in our bodies. There's also RNA and DNA digesting enzymes that are called ribonuclease and deoxyribonuclease that helps break these down as well. When you look at the liver ends up being divided into two lobes. You have the livers, again, so it's mostly covered by the visceral peritoneum. It's completely covered by a capsule made up of dense, irregular connective tissue. We find the liver lying, it's found deep to the peritoneum, and it gets divided into two lobes. There's a right lobe, which is much, much larger than the other side, which is the left lobe. It's held in place by the falciform ligament. Falciform ligament holds it in place. All right, so the right lobe is considered by many, a lot of anatomists, to include the inferior quadrate lobe. Okay, the inferior quadrate lobe, and the posterior quadrate lobe as well. Right. Now, on the basis of internal morphology, specifically we're talking about blood vessel distribution. the quadrate and caudate lobes, more appropriately, should be part of the left lobe, not the right. Right? This is according to that. Now, the falciform ligament, it extends from the undersurface of the diaphragm between the two principal parts of the liver. Okay. The free border of the falciform ligament is termed ligamentum teres. Okay, ligamentum teres. This is the free border of the falciform ligament. What's left? The gallbladder. Okay, yes, the gallbladder. It has a fundus and it has a body also to it. The two areas of the gallbladder. You can see this is the left lobe and this is the right lobe of the liver. And now you can see in the picture which side looks larger, another side looks much smaller. Here's our gallbladder that's found over here. And you can see the inferior vena cava, and also you can see the hepatic portal vein. Okay. All right. All right. All right. So the bile duct, branches of the hepatic artery, and branches of the hepatic vein are what's referred to as the portal triad. Okay. Portal triad. What does the portal triad consist of? Bile duct, a branch of the hepatic artery, and a branch of the hepatic vein. They form this portal triad. Now, hepatocytes, the bile duct system, as well as hepatic cyanoids, you can organize them into anatomical and functional units in a few different ways. So, you can say, for example, hepatic lobule. So, hepatic lobule, it was referred to as the functional part of the liver. Now, if you use this method, right? Each hepatic lobule you can consider to be shaped like it has 6 sides, so we call it a hexagon. So it's this hexagonal shape. At the center of it, you have the central vein, and as you radiate out from it, you have rows of hepatocytes and hepatic sinusoids. At the 3 corners of the hexagon, you have this portal triad. Now, this model we end up basing on liver images. Again, they use a pig model for that. It's much harder to find this in human livers. Now, portal lobule. The portal lobule, this model, it looks at the exocrine functions of the liver system. In other words, you're looking at its bile secretion. So according to the bile ducts of the portal triad, you take the bile duct as the central what do you use that as? The central, yeah. You look at this portal triad as the center of the portal lobule. The last one, this hepatic acinus, now they're starting to look at structural and functional units of the liver. Okay. So each hepatic acinus, and it ends up overlapping, and it also includes parts of neighboring hepatic lobules as well. All right. What else? Yeah, the hepatic acinus is the smallest structural and functional unit of the liver. Okay. It's the smallest structural as well as a functional unit of the liver. Okay. So if you look at hepatic blood flow, so the liver, it receives blood from two sources. Okay, from the hepatic artery, it ends up getting oxygenated blood, and from the hepatic portal vein, it receives deoxygenated blood that's containing newly absorbed nutrients, newly absorbed drugs, and possibly microbes and toxins as well from the GI tract. So branches of both hepatic artery and the hepatic portal vein, they carry blood into the hepatic sinusoids. And within the hepatic sinusoids, oxygen, most of the nutrients, as well as certain toxic substances, they get processed by the hepatocytes. Whatever the hepatocytes end up producing, okay, as well as nutrients that are needed by other cells, they end up being secreted back into the blood. And that blood ends up being drained into the central vein. And eventually it passes back into the hepatic veins. So because blood from the GI tract passes through the liver as part of this hepatic portal circulation, the liver is often called, not called, the liver is also the site of a metastasis of certain types of cancers, unfortunately. Okay. All right. Emulsification is just it's a term that's used to break down food. Chemical digestion of food is referred to as emulsification. You know about absorption. I told you that the liver produces the bile and the gallbladder stores the bile. We talked about carb, lipid, as well as protein metabolism already. We talked about the enzymes that are responsible for that as well. Yeah, protein metabolism, it involves hepatocyte deaminate. And again, what ends up happening is it removes amino groups from the amino acids. So that amino acids can be used for energy. Anything else? So again, once you deaminate these amino acids, these amino groups, you end up producing what? You end up producing ammonia. And again, ammonia ends up being converted into urine. Okay. Again, urine essentially, it's less toxic form. Urea is what's converted from that ammonia. So ammonia, toxic form, so you end up converting to urea. Now, urea you can safely store in your body for extended periods of time without affecting its physiology. The processing of drugs and hormones. All right, so let's take a break. We'll continue in a little bit, okay? Okay, so moving along, all right, processing of drugs and hormones. I think yeah, all right. So the liver can detoxify substances like alcohol, or again, it could secrete drugs like penicillin, erythromycin, sulfonamides into bile. The liver can also inactivate hormones like thyroid hormone, estrogen, as well as aldosterone. Aside from that, the liver will excrete bilirubin. Bilirubin is derived from the heme of old red blood cells. Okay, it ends up being absorbed by the liver from the blood and ends up being secreted into bile. Now, most of the bilirubin in bile ends up being metabolized in the small intestines by bacteria, and then it ends up being eliminated as feces. Um, Bile salts that are used in the small intestines for emulsification and absorption of lipids, cholesterol, phospholipids, and lipoprotein is the purpose for these salts. Now, aside from glycogen, the liver is also a storage site for vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin K, as well as vitamin B12. In addition to that, iron and copper also ends up being stored in the liver. And again, it ends up being released from the liver when it's needed in the body. Phagocytosis. So we have Kupffer cells of the liver. Okay, Kupffer, K-U-P-H. No, Kupffer, K-U-P-F-F-E-R, Kupffer. These Kupffer cells of the liver, they end up phagocytizing old red blood cells and white blood cells and even bacteria, certain bacteria. The liver, along with the skin and kidneys, they play a role in synthesizing the excuse me, the active form of vitamin D. So as I was telling you earlier, as I've already told you, small intestines ends up being divided into three parts. There's the duodenum, there is the jejunum, and then there is the ileum. Okay, duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. The shortest part is the duodenum, and duodenum's, again, it's about I don't know, it's about maybe 10 inches in length, maybe 25 centimeters, maybe a little bit more. That's the length for the duodenum. The next part is the jejunum. Jejunum is much, much, much longer. So again, it could be up to 1 meter, okay, which is about 3 feet in length. All right. So we have the duodenum, I'm sorry, and then we have the jejunum, and then the last part, and this is the longest part of the small intestines, is called the ileum. The ileum could be maybe 6 feet or about 2 meters. All right. So this is the longest part. So if you look at small intestines together, small intestines is over 2 meters, no, 3 meters in length actually. Okay, more than 3 feet or 3 meters. That's just the small intestines. Where the small intestines ends and where it connects to the liver, there's a valve, and that valve is called the ileocecal valve. Right. So when digestion is complete in the liver, then that valve will open up and push that contents into the large intestines. So again, what divides the ileum from the Large intestines, ileocecal valve. So here you go. You can see over here, you have the small intestines. You have you have the you can see the jejunum and the ileum over here. You can see the duodenum tiny bit. You can't see all of it, but here, tiny bit of it. This is the duodenum. It gets covered by this large intestines. Okay. Now, the wall of the small intestine is made up of the same 4 layers that make up the vast majority of the GI tract, and that's the mucosa, the submucosa, muscularis, and the serosa. So I'm not going to go back into details about that. The mucosa ends up being composed of a layer of epithelium, lamina propria, and the muscularis mucosa. Again, we've seen that earlier on. Now, the epithelial layers of the small intestinal mucosa is made up of simple columnar epithelium, and it has many types of cells that we find there. Amongst them, there's absorptive cells, there's goblet cells, there's enteroendocrine cells. There's also what are called the Paneth cells. P like Paul, A like Apple, N like Nancy, E like Edward, T like Tom, H like Henry. Paneth. These Paneth cells are also found over there. Absorptive cells of the epithelium, absorptive cells, end up secreting or they end up releasing enzymes that digest the food. Okay. Goblet cells, they, again, as you already know, because you talked about this, discussed this, goblet cells secrete hormones. What else do you see? All right. Talk about Paneth cells, intestinal glands. So, okay, intestinal glands, or the crypts of Laberkin, or not Lieberkin, sorry, crypts of Lieberkin. They secrete, again, intestinal fluids. Intestinal glands, aside from containing these goblet cells and absorptive cells, they also have what are called these so these Paneth cells. They also have these Paneth cells, as I mentioned earlier. And Paneth cells essentially are enteroendocrine cells. Enteroendocrine cells, that's what they are. Now, 3 types of these Paneth cells, or 3 types of these enteroendocrine cells, we find in the intestinal glands of the small intestines, and those are S like Sam, S cells. Okay, so there are the S cells. There's the CCK cells, and then there's the K cells. Okay, S cells secrete the hormone secretin. CCK, okay, they secrete cholecystokinin. Okay, cholecystokinin. What else is there? Okay, I think this is good. Is there anything else? Let me check. Yeah, so yeah, the S cells, you know, they secrete that secretin. And again, we find secretin in the jejunum as well as the duodenum. And again, they're stimulated by a drop in pH. Okay, when pH levels drop less than 4, it ends up being secreted into the small intestines. And then secretin release increases the secretion of bicarbonate into the lumen. Pancreas produces the bicarbonate, ends up coming to the lumen. CCK, okay, CCK also even called some people call it the gut peptide, cholecystokinin. Again, it gets released by these enteroendocrine cells that are found in the upper small intestines, as well as the jejunum. And CCK, it delays gastric emptying. Okay, it stimulates gallbladder contraction. So again, it gives you this feeling of fullness. You end up, it has a effect on your satiety level. It increases satiety. K cells we find in the mucosa of the duodenum as well as the jejunum of the gastrointestinal tracts. Okay, K cells, they're found in the duodenum, in the mucosa of the duodenum and the jejunum of the GI tract. All right, what else is there? I think that's enough about this slide. All right, the muscularis of the small intestines is made up of 2 layers of smooth muscles. Again, there's an outer thinner layer. It contains the longitudinal fibers, and then there's an inner thicker layer which has the circular fibers. Again, it's similar to it's the same as what we saw in the stomach. Not much of a difference there. Let's move along to the large intestines. So again, the opening from the ileum into the large intestines, there's a fold of mucous membrane, and that's called that ileocecal sphincter or the ileocecal valve. And again, it is what allows materials in the small intestines to pass into the large intestines. Now, inferior to the ileocecal valve, we have the cecum. Okay, cecum is a small pouch. It's maybe 6 centimeters long. Okay, attached to the cecum, you end up having this this string-like object. It looks like a piece of string in pictures, or a tiny thin tube. It's maybe 3 inches long. Okay, it's called. Some people call it the appendix. Other people call it the vermiform appendix. You can call it whatever you want, whichever one of these 2 terms. All right, that's the appendix. Remember, I said something about the appendix earlier on in the lecture. Hopefully, you guys were listening to that. All right, we talked about this already. Mucosa muscularis serosa. I'm not going to go over this because again, it's essentially the same. Yeah, so the muscularis, it's made up of an external layer and an internal layer of circular smooth muscles. Okay. Now, unlike other parts of the GI tract, portions of the longitudinal muscles, they're condensed and thickened, and they end up forming these very conspicuous bands that are called the tinea coli. Okay, tinea coli. That's what it is. Yeah, sorry. Tinea coli. That's spelled Teniae. Teniae coli. COLI. Yeah, these parts that look long and thin, again, they're referred to as tinea coli. All right, let's see. Moving along. Oh, Haustra. Sorry, I didn't cover this. Haustra. So, when you look at the large intestines, okay, when you look at the large intestine, you tend to see these little pouches that are formed, okay, by the different segments, and we call those pouches haustra. That's all it is. They're just haustra pouches. Let's see if there's a photograph of that. No photo of that, fortunately. So here, these areas would be called the haustra. See if we can find another picture, perhaps a better photograph. No. Histology is nearly identical. Again, haustra, when it starts contracting, we call that haustral churning. Again, peristalsis is just okay, all right. So functions of the large intestine, all right. So in terms of movement and function, so we talked about function elimination, right? Defecation is the function for the large intestine. Now, there's three types of movements that take place over here. The first one is haustral churning. So the haustra, they end up staying relaxed and distended while they fill up. So while, when the distension, it reaches a certain point, the walls contract and squeeze the content into the next haustrum, to the next chamber. There's also peristalsis, and peristalsis is what? It's just one part contracting and the other part relaxing simultaneously until it ends up pushing the food forward. Mass peristalsis, these are strong peristaltic waves that start at the middle of the colon and rapidly. Okay. Yeah, so the final stages, they end up occurring, final stages of digestion, they take place in the colon. So you have, let's see. Again, most of the final stages, they occur in the large intestines by bacterial activity, okay? So, with all that digestion, this breakdown, and the gases that get produced over there, and a result, gases get produced, and that's referred to as flatus. Again, bacteria. We talked about the breakdown of the different of bilirubin. Bilirubin ends up being turned into stercobilin. Stercobilin eventually ends up being excreted from the body as feces. Okay. All right. All right. So diarrhea and constipation. What's diarrhea? What's constipation? So if you're not taking in enough fibers, that could be a cause for diarrhea. If you're not drinking enough water, that's another cause for diarrhea. If you're eating too much meat and not enough fiber, again, this is a cause for constipation. Diarrhea, so again, constipation is when you're backed up, you don't have a bowel movement in more than a day, more than 2 days. This is a constipation. Diarrhea, on the other hand, is after you eat food within an hour or two, you end up having a watery discharge of feces from your body. Okay, so this is what diarrhea is, and both of these conditions, they could be dangerous. Between the two, again, it's hard to say which is more dangerous, but let's say that in the a lot of people, they end up getting constipated after they have they have some type of an anesthesia. And this is one of the side effects of anesthesia. Okay. All right. That's it for this this part. All right.